Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We're going to give another minute or two for people to come in, and then we will get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Daisy Galan. I am a lead program analyst at the National Association of County and City Health Officials, NACHO. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our November Model Aquatic Health Code Network webinar. Today, we're going to be learning about the interim guidance for safe operation of artificial swimming lagoons. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording along with the PDF file of the slides with all the registrants after today's webinar. Also, if you have questions throughout the presentations, please use our Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will have plenty of time at the end to get to each of your questions and for our discussion. Next slide, please. So this is today's agenda. We're going to start with a presentation about artificial swimming lagoons from our two speakers who are joining us today, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. Next slide. So today we are honored to be joined by Dewey Case and Commander Joe Lako. Dewey Case served as the technical director for the Council for the Model Aquatic Health Code, working in aquatics industry for over 20 years. He has served the YMCA of USA, as well as the local state chapters of the American Red Cross by providing expertise in aquatics. Prior to his current role with the CMAHC, he served on the first and third editions of the MAHC in a volunteer role. Dewey was recognized as a self-proclaimed aquatics lifer by the Aquatics International in 2018 Power Issue, holding multiple instructor trainee certifications from the American Red Cross, as well as instructor credentials with the Pool and Hot Tub Alliance. He enjoys helping other aquatic facilities improve operations and helping young aquatic professionals hone and develop their craft. In addition to his service in the CMAHC, Dewey also served as the Association Aquatics Director for the Family YMCA of Southeast Mississippi. Today, we're also joined by Commander Joe Lako. Commander Joe Lako is an active duty service member of the U.S. Public Health Service and is stationed at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. Commander Lako is an environmental health scientist in the National Center for Environmental Health, Water, Food, and Environmental Service branch. He provides environmental technical support and expertise to state, local, territorial, and tribal entities. Commander Lako works closely with the National Center for Emerging and Zoonotic Infectious Diseases, the Center for Preparedness and Response, the Centers for Global Health, and the CDC Emergency Operations Center. His work focused largely on recreational water, emergency and outbreak response, food safety, drinking water, wastewater, vector control, safety, and PPE, as well as hazard materials. Commander Lako is a registered sanitarian and a registered environmental health specialist through the National Environmental Health Association. With this introduction, it is my pleasure to welcome Commander Lako as our first speaker for today's webinar.
Well, thank you, Daisy, and welcome to everybody. We really appreciate your attendance today. It's been a few years now since the CMAHC, one of our partners, and CDC were first introduced to this concept of an artificial swimming lagoon. And when I first saw pictures of what they look like, my initial thought was, no way. These can't possibly be real. There's no way they can be maintained as safe. So I had a learning curve, and I think the most important part of me buying into the concept of these artificial swimming lagoons was that education and that understanding that I was able to gain about how they're designed, how they're worked, and what the expectations are for their operation and maintenance. So we wanted to put together some guidance for jurisdictions that may have these types of facilities being built in the near future, if not already. There are a handful of these artificial lagoons already present in the United States. 3 states already have some minimal legislation in their health code: North Carolina, Texas, and Florida. Do mention artificial swimming lagoons and some of the unique aspects of them in their health code, the swimming pool regulations. But there wasn't anything in the MAC. CDC and CMAHC didn't have anything. So we put together an ad hoc committee to talk about these and what are some of the unique things you need to think about and worry about when you're trying to build and operate one of those. And the ad hoc committee put together a guidance document, and Dewey is going to go ahead and talk about that. He and I were both on the ad hoc committee, and he's going to highlight some of the features of artificial swimming lagoons and some recommendations that CDC is working on to get put in place as an interim guidance in lieu of the CR, the change request to the Model Aquatic Health Code, with the grand hopes of one day getting it fine-tuned, having it in good shape, and getting it placed into the MAC through the CR and amendment process. So I'd like to turn it back over here to Dewey Case. He's our, as Daisy mentioned, our technical director for the CMAHC, and he's going to walk us through some of this weird concepts of these artificial swimming lagoons. Dewey?
Great. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Daisy. Next slide, please. So, the big thing to start off with is whatever conception you have about swimming pools, you want to take that and set it to a side. As Joe mentioned, these things are really unique. They're novel, they're different, they're immense. And just as a pool nerd, I find them really, really cool. The complexity of them, the integration of technology, and how they're accomplishing this massive, in many cases, billion gallons of water. So really, really cool thing. So what is a swimming lagoon, right? Basic definition that's been developed is a large aquatic body with a large venue format. Think acres of pool water. The ASL, as we commonly refer to it in abbreviation, is designed to mimic a natural water body and has a couple of different designated swimming areas, at least one, with the remainder for non-traditional swimming uses, right? So kayaking, paddleboarding, windsurfing, boating rather, scuba training, scuba diving. These are all kind of found within this artificial swimming lagoon. So it's essentially this mix of an open water lake type environment, but not really a lake, with this traditional swimming pool type features. Next slide, please. Inside of an ASL, the swimming lagoon, there's going to be a designated swimming area. So a DSA is a section of water that's reserved for swimming, bathing, wading, the traditional swimming pool activities. It's typically separated from the rest of the ASL with a buoy line or other similar device as recognized by the AHJ. Now, Where DSAs differ from swimming pools is, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, is that water quality is achieved by maintaining a positive hydraulic gradient versus a typical turnover. And in general, the DSA is going to be much shallower than the open water areas used for boating, kayaking, paddle boarding, and other non-traditional aquatic activities, non-traditional as far as swimming pools go in this case. And it should be noted that swimming and bathing generally aren't permitted outside of the DSAs. Next slide, please. So when we think about a swimming lagoon, and this is just one picture of a lagoon, and you can see this is an immense amount of water. They're generally aesthetic focused. Not only are they there for recreational settings and for safe, controlled swimming environments, but they're also just pretty. They're pretty, they're attractive. They have more than one use than just people getting in the water. They're a destination setting, so to speak. They're generally designed to give this tropical setting, this tropical illusion, where, instead of, let's say, a lake in Canada, it looks more like a beach in Maui. And they can offer, again, a wide variety of water-based activities. I do want to draw your attention just to the scope of this image. So if you look center of the image in the very back, you're going to see the designated swimming area. Zero entry moving into, that's where we see the positive hydraulic gradient. And you can tell just by the scale and the image that this is truly a very, very big pool. Next slide, please. So how does this differ, right? We're talking, again, massive water volumes in the order of millions to billions of gallons with a very, very high dilution rate when compared to conventional swimming pools. The construction is generally going to be different. We're not going to see your typical plaster on gunite or tile on concrete on gunite construction. We're going to see line systems. We're going to see not necessarily the formed walls, gunite walls that you'd see in a swimming pool. We're also going to see slightly different water treatment technology, and this would vary depending on who the manufacturer and developer of these systems are. And again, the key to these things are they're multi-use. You're going to see multiple activities going on of varying types at the same time, right? Whether it's an area identified for open water diving, open water swimming per se with the triathlon, just the variety of activities is mind-boggling as we look at these venues. Next slide, please. So when we think about a swimming lagoon, we have what we're referring to as a hybrid approach, right? In that you have, again, lake-like activities in a water sports area, and then the pool-like activities in the designated swimming area. So how are some of these differences, or how are people going to be kept safe in these particular areas, right? So when we look at the water sports area, the lake-like area, again, we see this being reserved for water sports and those type of activities, but also water quality is going to be handled in a little more unique way. With this kind of volume of water, we're not talking about turnover in 6 hours. We're not talking about maintaining a minimum free chlorine level of 1 part per million, but instead we're looking more at bacteriological testing and water clarity standards. The water sports area is not going to be a regulated bather load. This is an immense area, and just by default, you're not going to see high concentrations of people like you would in a DSA. And then for construction, again, it's a different, unique construction, and we would look at specific areas for safety. For example, in most swimming lagoons, they have a basin. And this basin would be restricted from use, restricted from access by certainly not swimmers, but also those participating in water sports. And then addressing, of course, safety issues and looking at how do we address lifeguards, how do we address standard signage. In the pool-like area, this DSA, here's where things get a little bit more interesting, and we see this hybrid approach. And that within the DSA, we're going to see very, very similar concepts to a typical aquatic venue, right? A typical closed swimming pool that we see, a closed body for recreation and or competition. So we're going to see very, very similar standards. We're going to see chlorine levels and sanitizer levels that are familiar to us. We're going to see pH ranges that are familiar to inspectors and to users. We're going to see depth markers. Right? We're going to see float and safety lines and rope lines, rather. We're going to see these things, and we're very, very familiar with. We're going to see also a bather load for these DSAs, and they're going to be familiar to us, right? We're not talking 200 people per square foot. We're talking, 20 square feet per person, rather. And really the most interesting thing of the DSA is the way these swimming lagoons are built. We can't talk in terms of turnover. So renewal rate is a word that's being, or phrase rather, that's being used. Water replacement is another one that's been used. But we're settling on renewal rate for this DSA. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Construction side, you're going to see pretty standard requirements on slopes and depth markers and such, as well as requiring the use of lifeguards in safety as a safety aspect for these DSAs. It's important to note that lifeguarding, when we talk about these artificial swimming lagoons, the lifeguards are restricted in scope to the DSA and not the entire lagoon. This does not prohibit the owner and developer of the lagoon from creating some sort of additional safety mechanism for the water sports area, but the requirements are not to put lifeguards all throughout this lagoon in these just thousands of linear feet of pool and thousands of square feet of water surface area. Next slide, please. So we're just going to show a couple of photos just to give you some scope of what these look like. This is another lagoon of varying shapes and designs and size. And really the cool thing about the lagoon from a construction aspect is it's not limited to a rectangular shape. These are going to be free form. I mean, these are built to look like largely a natural body of water. They can fit very well into the landscape. And again, this goes back to that aesthetic focused, and that they don't necessarily have to be an intrusion into the landscape of the area it's being built in. Next slide, please. Just showing a different option. Here, we see a very large DSA and possible DSA areas that the developer would have to account for. But also what's unique about these is you see this placement inside a mixed area where there are residences that can have access to the lagoon and have that accentuate their property as a feature, and again, just as an aesthetic purpose. Next slide, please. So when we talk about this concept of a renewal rate, right, this water flow from a DSA to the open water area, what will happen in these systems is starting from the filtration system, you'll see very similar concepts where water is filtered, water is treated, water is returned. The difference is going to be once you get to the designated swim area, then we start talking in terms of renewal rate. So the renewal rate is going to be very similar to the minimum 6-hour turnover we see for recreational aquatic venues, commercial aquatic venues, with the exception of instead of the water in this DSA area being immediately returned to the filtration system, it's going to be pushed out with this positive hydraulic gradient into the water sports area, where it is diluted, where it is mixed with the overall body of water, and then eventually returned through this basin, through the sump area, refiltered and disinfected and returned into the DSA. So effectively, the DSA serves as one large return, pushing all water into this water sports area and through the filtration system. Next slide, please. So here we see with dye tracer conformation, we see how this DSA, this renewal rate actually works. And as you can tell, it's very effective. So in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, you see where the dye is applied through the returns for the DSA. And you see within 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 25 minutes, how this dye is dissipated and pushed into the water sports area, this open area of the lagoon. And as you can tell by this dye application, it's extremely effective. And after 25 minutes, almost all of the dye is pushed out of this DSA. So we do see very, very high renewal rates. Oftentimes they can surpass the 6-hour turnover rate we see required in commercial swimming venues, aquatic venues. Next slide, please. So we have to kick back and think about the 4th edition. In 2020, we had an ad hoc committee that was formed initially, and many of the current members are holdovers from that committee that worked on creating a change request to be included in the 4th edition MAC as a novel venue. So this was all intended to be included in section 412, specific aquatic venues, and would have its own subsection for artificial swim lagoons, as well as an operations segment in chapter 5, the operations side of the MAC that would further detail operational requirements for artificial swim lagoons. And a lot of work was put into these change requests. However, when it made it to the review process at the technical support committee level and the technical review committee level, there were additional questions that we had to go back and answer. Things like ADA access, things like tile markers. And really, we realized we need to educate on swimming lagoons and how these are truly different and need to be thought of differently from traditional aquatic venues. So the change request submitted for the 4th edition wasn't quite ready for prime time, so it did get bumped back. We have reconvened that committee, having been working over the last year or so to move this needle forward into refining and addressing those concerns. Next slide, please. So ultimately, the technical review committee did recommend a no vote for this change request for the 4th edition MAC. And this was affirmed by membership and the CMAHC board of directors. So it did not make it into the 4th edition. However, it was highly recommended by the TRC to improve this work, this change request, and resubmit for the 5th edition. So that is what's happening now. We have reconvened the CMAHC Ad Hoc Committee for Artificial Swimming Lagoons to revise the change request and to reevaluate these systems, or this change request rather, reevaluate how the approach is made on artificial swimming lagoons to make sure they're healthy and safe, but also to acknowledge that these are novel and unique venues and that they're not your traditional swimming pool. And that's honestly one of the hardest battles to think about and to face with these venues, is that we're so used to the traditional gunite, plaster finish, square, enclosed, small volume of water. And these things really are different. And for those that are attending today, I would encourage you to set aside preconceived notions and really look at these as different facilities, right? We can't look at them in the exact same light that we do our traditional venue. And that's a message I'll be sharing for the foreseeable future. Next slide, please. So in light of the failed change request for the 4th edition, what was identified is that we need guidance now. There are facilities that are out there operating in the United States and territories for these swimming lagoons. They are growing. There's an additional project in South Carolina that reached out to CDC for guidance. These things are coming, and they're coming in a big way to the United States. So in light of that, CDC recognized the need to develop interim guidance. So this is a task that we've been working on for several months at this point. CMAHC is working in an advisory committee with the ad hoc committee to help CDC develop interim guidance. We do hope this comes out soon. We have an initial draft that's making the rounds through the clearance process at CDC, and we're close, but we hope that this will be released in first quarter or at the latest second quarter 2023. The information found in this interim guidance will be based on science and best practices. It will be performance-based when possible, and it will be developed for potential inclusion into, hopefully, the 5th edition of the MAHC. Next slide, please. So on this, the Artificial Swimming Lagoons Ad Hoc Committee, this committee composed of our CMAHC technical experts, our state health officials, industry experts from the lagoon industry, as well as subject matter experts from the CDC in recreational water. This includes myself and Joe Lako, representing CMAHC and CDC directly. And again, interim guidance is in development. We are in a fair click on this. We've done some really good work, and we're very happy with it. But again, it does have to clear CDC guidance, and we hope that will happen again first quarter, second quarter of 23. And then the other emphasis, the big emphasis of this committee is focusing on understanding these lagoons as a venue-specific concept, right? As a novel venue, as not tied to necessarily your traditional swimming pool operations. And most importantly, how can this guidance help create safe operational practices and safe construction practices while acknowledging that is a new venue and that there are challenges that as regulators, as builders, as operators that have never had to be faced before in the history of recreational water. Next slide, please. So here you see just a quick snapshot of our ad hoc committee members. And I have to say, we have an exceptional group of individuals that are working on this with lots of really, really high level technical feedback. And I'm very happy with the work that they're doing and the expertise and knowledge and information they're bringing to the table. Next slide, please. So in this interim guidance that's being developed, what are some of the things that we're seeing? We're seeing obviously technical specifications in regards to materials and the structure. We're addressing access and egress issues, as well as how zero depth entry ties into access and egress. And one of the interesting things that we think about, right, is ADA guidance. How do we have ADA access? We're accustomed to the world of pool lifts and steps and everything else. But with these unique venues, it's really interesting because the massively long zero depth entry is essentially one large ADA access point, as well as the other boats and ramps we see in the water sports area. So a really interesting thing to tackle and address is, how do we deal with ADA access? And really, is there any need to be more prescriptive than the zero entry area? Same thing with depth markers and depth markings. Again, in the DSA, we're going to see very traditional approaches, knowing that once we get out of the DSA, that shifts dramatically. And we've mentioned recirc and water treatment. We're looking at minimum chlorine levels. We're looking at prescribing a minimum NTU, both for the DSA and specifically for the open water area, requiring that the open water area is, the bottom is visible and static, meaning no wave action. Hygiene facilities are pretty standard, as well as wastewater supply, wastewater disposal. Next slide, please. So, again, when we look at operations and maintenance, including, which would be section 5 of the MAHC, we see general things we talk about, right? Again, water quality. DSA versus the water sports area, sanitizer levels, et cetera. And again, I've already mentioned on water clarity, where this is going to be very, very, very clear water. This is not going to be murky water. This will not be lake water. You will be able to see the bottom in the water sports area, and certainly in the DSA area. In the DSA, again, we see very traditional ranges of chlorine and pH and sanitizer levels. In the open water area, again, we shift more to a water quality sample than necessarily a free chlorine sample. Again, in the designated swimming areas, you're going to see very similar testing frequency for your traditional aquatic venues. In the water sports area, what is being proposed is essentially bacteriological testing. And it's interesting in that, again, we take this hybrid approach. We don't traditionally test for bacteriological elements in traditional swimming pools, but the water sports area, although it kind of looks like a grown version of it, is not a traditional pool. So we're borrowing from elements and other standards, EPA for lake water, recreational lake water, USA triathlon standards, right, on what needs to be incorporated into this testing frequency and this testing sample to make sure that it is as protective as possible without requiring a minimum free chlorine level in the larger water sports area. And it should be noted that between dilution factors and the type of use this will be, it's anticipated that the bacterial load, right, that would necessitate a high halogen level is not the same at all for traditional swimming pools. And that's another concept as regulators, as operators, we have to kind of wrap our heads around, is that dilution may be fairly effective in preventing disease transmission and pathogen transmission, resulting in a much, much lower level of halogen or free chlorine. Okay. Next slide, please. So what's the current status? We have worked as an ad hoc committee to develop recommendations for CDC. For swimming lagoons. And again, the intent is this interim guidance, when released, would serve until this could be integrated into the MAC, preferably in the 5th edition, and hopefully not so late, but hopefully at the least the 6th edition. But we're shooting for the 5th edition inclusion. The document's now in CDC clearance, so again, we hope for a first quarter, second quarter release. We also are including in the guidance document schematic illustrations to show this DSA and this hydraulic gradient. It will be uploaded to the CDC's Healthy Swimming website upon completion and once it's made it through clearance, as well as we'll develop into a change request for the 5th edition MAC. Next slide. So again, this is just us. So if you have any questions about this or other topics, please feel free to reach out to us at CMAHC. Next slide, please. And as always with CMAHC, we're driven by your expertise, and we need your expertise and your input to serve on our various committees, to vote on the code, and just to, in general, support us in our efforts in supporting the MAC, educating, advocating for the MAC, and advocating for the industry. So visit cmac.org today and consider joining us and lending your expertise into the work that we do. Next slide, please. At this point, we'll turn it back over to Daisy and Joe, and we'll start looking at Q&A and any discussion.
Thank you so much, Dewey, and thank you, Joe. It's really a pleasure to have you guys' expertise on today's webinar. So we thank everyone for joining. Again, if you have any questions, please use our Q&A box. We already see some questions being submitted here. I'm going to start with 2 questions that were already answered by Joe, but I think it would be great for those on the call to also hear it and as part of our today's discussion. The first question was about the geographical location of these artificial swimming lagoons. Are they more often found in warmer climates, or have they been proposed in cold weather climates as well?
They generally, as far as the US goes, we are seeing them right now in warmer climates. So predominantly ASL constructions have been in Florida and Texas, with again, one that's been built in North Carolina. There's a proposed construction in South Carolina. What I would anticipate is that as these things grow in popularity, as developers want to have a really interesting and niche approach to their community developments, I would anticipate that we do start to see these more in northern climates, northern latitudes. These are also built around the world and not just in the US. And globally, we do see these predominantly in warmer water climates, warmer weather climates as a tourist destination and something that drives local tourism.
Great. Thank you so much, Dewey. The next question asks about the drain requirements. Do you anticipate drain requirements to resemble those currently in place for swimming pools?
I would not.
Yeah.
I would not. That one's kind of a really interesting thing to deal with. And to be perfectly honest, as far as drain requirements, they're not going to look like we typically see in pools. However, it's noted that just to support these circulation systems, we're already talking about unblockable drains. You can't support the circulation system of these things with just a standard 12 by 12 or 18 by 18 grate. They're going to need very large grading and very large pipe diameter. So that in itself would essentially make these things VGB compliant because they'll be unblockable drains. It's also noted that the water is not pulled from the water sports area. The water going back to the recirculation system would be pulled from a separate basin, which is not accessible by bathers or by kayakers, windsurfers. This will be in a closed off area that is not accessible to the public.
Thank you, Dewey. Joe, feel free to jump in as well, as I know you're both here joining us for this Q&A. So the next question is about testing for halogens. Where do you test for halogens? Right at the zero depth entry, it would be the highest and then gradually drop off towards the other end. So where do you take the sample?
Well, keep in mind that the DSA is where all the water for the entire venue is going to be pushed in. So the inlets are going to be floor inlets that are going to be spread throughout the designated swimming areas. Many of these types of venues have been trying to utilize technology where the probes can constantly monitor the water chemistry, and with the operators complementing that with manual testing, I think that they're going to be able to maintain that chlorine residual. So of course, the sampling area, the sampling place where the question is getting to, of course, would not be, right there on the shore. It would have to be out in water where there's some depths where you would typically collect a water sample from a pool. Someone's going to have to get wet.
Yeah, and one thing I want to chime in on too is that please know that this is a work in progress, right? With a new venue, with a novel venue, it's really hard to have all the answers out of the gate. So, in keeping of kind of this MAC concept is evolution, right? as these things are out there and as they get in practice and as regulators are seeing them more and more, we're going to see a moving of the needle, right? To where, the concepts we have in place now will be further refined over the next several versions of the MAC until we find it to where, okay, it's where it needs to be, right? And just being honest, these are new. And when you have something new, oftentimes you don't get it perfect out of the box. But the goal isn't to have something perfect out of the box. The goal is right now, here's what we think is best based off science and best practices. And here's the guidance and information for regulators. And it's going to shift and change slightly over the years.
Thank you. So since we're talking about, the tests, there's another question here. Where may I access information on the specific quality tests and levels used for the bacteria evaluation in surface recreational waters, such as the lake and beach contact recreational standards? What is the triathlon standards mentioned, and is there a website for that information?
Yeah, the EPA, they're the ones that kind of keep a handle on those natural bodies of water. In particular, our coastal and boundary waters. They provide funding to all of the states that have a border with some water on it. So our Great Lakes states and our Atlantic and Pacific states, Gulf Coast states, and they do have a set of standards for marine water as well as freshwater. And it's broken down per risk category dependent on use. So the levels that are acceptable for the primary use is bathing is going to be different than if the primary use is for boating. And those are available on EPA's website. That's a really great question because it's one that we're currently wrestling with right now with the ad hoc committee. We don't test for bacteriological levels in the swimming area. Maintaining the halogen residual should dictate that there's nothing there. But because of the dilution, because of the influence of the sun and the environment, it's probably necessary to track something because there's not going to be too much chlorine left in the open water. So monitoring of bacteriological levels like you do on a lake is, the next best thing. However, it's not a lake. It's not a true aquatic habitat. It's not a true aquatic environment that's influenced the same way a natural body of water is. One of my favorite things to tell if a pool is in pretty good shape is clarity. Now, if it's crystal clear, it doesn't mean all your water chemistry is perfect. But if it's murky and yucky, you better believe that there's some stuff out of whack. So that's one of the criteria that we have in both the swimming areas and the non-swimming areas, the recreational sports area, is to maintain that water clarity. And the expectation is that it will be crystal clear. The aesthetics are very important for these, and being able to see to the bottom that maybe 20 or 30 feet deep is the realistic expectation. So I think having bacteriological levels that are pretty strict will easily be achievable just because of the quality and the clarity that will be constantly maintained. If we set it at primary use for swimming, that's pretty low, but that's still pretty dirty compared to pool water. If we set it the same as or secondary exposure, like for boating use, that's pretty dirty water that looks like a lake, a real lake. And this isn't never going to look like a real lake. So we have to be fair about it. And we have to have some discussions about it and realistic about it. And we're trying to figure out what's going to be the best thing, because there isn't an exact fit to set that standard, because there's nothing out there like these types of places. Moving along here for the sake of time, I see another question about lifeguards with the inflatables, the structured areas, the play areas that may be in designated swimming areas. in regards to lifeguards? The answer to that is yes. Where swimming is permitted, that would be designated as a swimming area. Those will require certified lifeguards.
And Joe and Dewey, how about motorized boats? Are there any guidelines where they
Yes.
can be used in order
There
to?
are. That was my first question. When I first saw my first picture, one of these things, I saw a boat on there. I'm like, no way, you can't have people swimming where there's gasoline powered motors. So there are no motorized boats or watercraft vehicles that are allowed. So I think the question alluded to electric vehicles that would be allowed. So if you had a jet ski or a boat, those would be powered by electricity. And then, of course, the kayaking and the sailing and the paddle boarding don't have that. But yeah, that's an important concept to keep the petroleum products out of there.
And Joe, going back and talking about the chemistry of the water, and this question talks about potential algae blooms interfering with the water quality in warm climates. Is this something that has been discussed?
Yeah, some of the technology that's being developed on how to maintain these. So I really like the way Dewey described it. They look pretty. And to make sure they stay looking pretty, some of the technology involves some flocculation of some suspended solids, as well as some vacuum systems that can gather and gobble up all of those things that have been clumped together. But I do think having concerns for algae growth or any water inhabitants is always going to be, the challenge and the struggle.
Yeah.
There's no doubt there's going to be some duck that flies over and lands in there. But I think it's also important to note that all of the water entering into the swimming areas is going to be regular old pool water, and that gets pushed away. So,
and I just want to add that, with these facilities, this is a major monetary investment. The filtration systems alone will likely cost more than most pools, commercial pools are built to. So it's a lot on the line financially, and that's before the developers look at surrounding structures and income revenue streams. We're not going to have a 20-year-old kid who just completed a CPO course in June operating these facilities. They're going to have very specific training that's going to be, obviously handled by the developer. But yeah, we're not talking about 20-year-olds maintaining a pool. These are going to be highly trained, highly educated folks running very, very specific systems and very sophisticated systems. So yeah, I would be surprised if we see a major algae bloom in one of these, just by nature of how much is on the line for the operators and developers.
Yeah, these are, I think, going to be designed as, to bring in revenue and to attract people.
And since you both mentioned the costs, not only to build, but to maintain, would you have at least an estimate on an idea, or also the length of time that it would take to develop something like this?
On the length, I'm unsure. You're definitely looking at construction around a year plus, probably closer to 2 years. If I had to guess, this is just a guess, by the time you do the land development and prep the infrastructure. But as far as cost, we're looking at tens of millions of dollars. Yeah.
I know we're running close on time here, and I just saw a question pop up I really wanted to get to about accessibility. Am I able to share my screen, Daisy?
You should be able to, Joe, yes.
Okay. I
can
want to
start-
show everybody.
Yeah.
Oh, it says I cannot share while another participant. Oh, there we go.
oh, there.
Let me see. I want to show everybody another schematic that I found to be pretty helpful. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can see that, Joe.
Okay. So this is actually a schematic that I put together with some of our creative services developers here at CDC. And this is a drawing. It's based off a drawing that I saw a long time ago to help me really understand how these things work. And going back to the question. You still can see the schematic, right?
Yes, we can still see the schematic.
Okay. I lost the question. Oh, here we go. Acceptable access barriers between that are similar to traditional swimming pools, and how are that different with an ASL? If you think back to some of those pictures that Dewey was able to provide that showed the scope and the breadth of the acres that may be involved with these, those would have a permanent enclosure around it to restrict access. Of course, where the swimming is permitted and the zero depth entry that you can see on the screen there would also need to be some barriers or enclosures with the self-latching gate to restrict access during designated times when supervision lifeguards are available. So yeah, the same idea is about having a fence around the zero depth entry area, the beach area, would be very beneficial to keep unauthorized people like little kids out of there when the area is not open.
Joe, since we're on this topic, there's another question here along the same lines. So Kelsey is from Washington State, and she's saying that there's an artificial swimming lagoon in her county that doubles as an emergency irrigation reservoir for nearby fields. It also had a waterfall feature that used a recirculating drain. A 10-year-old child was swimming near the drain and ended up being sucked into the pipe and drowned. They shut off the waterfall feature permanently, but I believe there's some sort of drain system for the irrigation system. Do you foresee any way for the artificial swimming lagoons to be permitted with the irrigation system still attached and provisions made, or should it be modified so that it cannot be used for irrigation?
That's a tragic story. I'm very sad that occurred. That's the first I've heard of these being used for any other purpose other than the swimming and water sports. So that's a new one. I would put in a recommendation that be not permitted to pull from that water source for any other use.
Thank you. There's another question here talking about maintenance, where the unit or specific the RSA would be required to be drained. What challenges have you encountered with the discharging of such large amounts of water? Do you foresee any structural issues with a full draining of the unit?
That's going to be a challenging one. And it may be one that's not necessarily answered by the health department. It may be another aspect of local city or state government that handles like natural resources. But yeah, there needs to be some consideration about what needs to happen when these things shut down, because essentially once they stop operating, it'll turn into, a 20-acre pond. And 20-acre ponds, we know, that could be a mosquito habitat and cause issues for people that have access to it. But there's 20-acre ponds all over the United States by the millions. So how those are typically handled, I think there's a lot of variability there from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And we may need to reference how those types of environments are typically handled.
And lastly, we have, I believe it's more of a comment, but I don't know if, Joe, you and Dewey have any comments to add to this. So our participant says, Imagine has this develops an indoor bubble concept, adding to requirements for ventilation might be wanted by developers. Is this something that you have heard on your conversations, or given the size of this venues, is this something that would even be possible?
Oh,
You know,
boy.
yeah.
I'm not so sure.
Yeah, just from a construction perspective, right? I agree with the person asking the question, in that I can see how that would be explored, just have an additional feature. The problem is going to be in heating. So obviously, if we enclose it, we're talking about a colder venue to extend that swim season. But to heat this thing, it's going to be financially almost unobtainable. The size heaters you would need to heat up this water returning from the system into the DSA, just to lose it going out to the water sports area, that alone, the sizing is cost prohibitive, even for these massive facilities. And then just the expense would be prohibitive. I don't foresee it, but you never know what the future brings and new technology brings, and what developers want to use it for.
Yeah, I guess it depends on how much money someone's willing to spend.
Yeah.
This would require having
Yep.
structures as big as some of the largest warehouses that we have in our country. Acres and acres in size.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both. I think we're getting close to the end here. I don't see any additional questions on our Q&A box, but I want to give you both an opportunity. Do you have any closing remarks, or any information that our participants need to keep in mind, where more additional information will be shared in the upcoming months?
Well, as Dewey mentioned, we're trying to work on some CDC guidance that will be reflective of the work of the ad hoc committee. And every time we take a close look at it, more and more questions come up, new things pop up that we hadn't thought of before. And we really want to try to get ahead of a lot of those questions and have them pre-answered in the interim guidance before it's issued. But the plan is to have a CDC interim guidance available on the CDC website prior to the 5th edition of the MAC. And we probably will get some feedback on it. We'll probably get some comments on it after it's made available, and that'll be welcomed as we fine tune it for inclusion in the MAC with a 5th edition through a change request. And I imagine that change request would be submitted on behalf of the ad hoc committee, the CMAHC Ad Hoc Committee, with folks like Dewey and myself.
Yep, correct. I would just add in to our regulators and operators that are on this webinar today, is just a reminder to open your mind a little bit. It's real easy to think in terms of, 4 walls and closed systems. But I would definitely, encourage to open your mind to the possibilities of what this venue could be, and think of how it can be operated and regulated safely, and at the same time respecting the novel nature. We're entering into a phase of the aquatic recreation industry where we're going to start seeing more and more novel facilities. It's not just this one. It's not just swimming lagoons, right? We have surf venues that are out there. We have all sorts of new and exciting hybrid possibilities that are being explored that will definitely challenge us as regulators. So I'll just, I would encourage everyone, keep an open mind and, think of ways that we can create safe swimming lagoons and safe novel venues without being overly restrictive.
Well, again, thank you so much, Joe and Dewey, for joining today's webinars. And thank you, all our participants. Thank you for the great questions submitted. If you have any additional questions that comes to mind after today's presentation, please email us. We added our email address here in the chat. We'll be happy to follow up with you separately and answer any questions. As a reminder for everyone, today's webinar was recorded, and we will be sharing the link of the recording and a copy of the slides in a follow-up email after the webinar. So keep an eye for it in the upcoming days. We hope everyone have a wonderful rest of your week and a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday next week. And we will see you here next time for our next MAHC Network webinar. See you soon. Thank you everyone for joining.